Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here this evening. My interest, as of course you've heard, is Jewish genealogy. Let me just put this back in my pocket and we'll be set. One of the things I wanted to just mention a little bit is that in my volunteer life, in which all of us genealogists seem to have a very good and vibrant volunteer life, one of the things I do is I'm a moderator for the Jewish Gen discussion group, which is an online forum. And we get many, many questions from Jewish genealogists who are doing their ongoing research. We also occasionally get questions from people who have not before known that they had any Jewish ancestry, or perhaps they're doing research and see something that maybe they think might be Jewish. We have lots of experts among our volunteers who just answer questions for each other. It's been really, really nice. So what I noticed in a number of these questions that we get from people who are not have not realized that they had any Jewish ancestry or think they might, is that there really aren't a whole lot of set answers, but there are a number of answers. And I hope tonight to be able to guide you in the right directions if you have notions that you might have some Jewish background. First off, one of the questions we need to always ask is why Jewish genealogy at all? And of course, there are a number of different answers to that. If you're someone like me who is Jewish or knows that your parents or your grandparents were Jewish, in my case, I know that my great-grandparents were Jewish and likely before that Jewish as well, then obviously it makes sense to continue in this vein. Some people I've heard from, and I've had as clients or have heard from on the discussion forum, just feel spiritually that they've always been drawn to Judaism. And that's not something that I would have thought seriously about until recently, when we found that a woman by the name of Ginny Milgram, who was born in Cuba to a Catholic family, came to the United States with her family in 1960. She went through all Catholic schools, always feeling very drawn spiritually to Judaism. Eventually, she wound up changing her religion and became Jewish. She converted. And after that, and her family wasn't particularly thrilled about that, but after that, she received, after her grandmother died, she received some items from her grandmother that she just kind of said, wait a second, these are Jewish items. What's this about? And she started doing this research. She wound up, amazingly, and I think she may be the first one to have ever done this, going back to 15 grandmothers into Spain and proving that these people were conversos and were what we call crypto-Jews, people who converted on the outside so they wouldn't get killed during the Inquisition, but actually kept some aspects of Judaism alive. And she's written a couple of books about this. One thing I meant to say earlier, I had my crib notes and I wound up leaving them home, is that all the information I give you here tonight, I don't have a whole lot of URLs or web addresses on my presentation, but all the URLs are on the handout. So you don't need to quickly copy everything down. They should be on the handout that comes with this presentation. Sometimes you're doing research and you start hearing a story about someone in your family who might have been Jewish. And this kind of story, years ago it might have been something that was hush-hush. But now, these days, people find this much more interesting. They're valuing diversity in their lineage. And when they see something like this, they say, well, I want to pursue this and see if I can find anything else about it. Sometimes people are researching and they find a Jewish-sounding name or a name that sounds Jewish to them. And they want to know, is it possible that that person was Jewish? And lastly, and it's certainly not the least, is that DNA testing has become very popular among genealogists. And more of us are seeing, particularly when we do autosomal DNA testing that tests both sides of the family and gives us sort of that ethnic pie chart, that some people are surprised to see some Jewish makeup in that pie chart. So those are all good reasons to start thinking about pursuing it if you haven't, pursuing Jewish genealogy if you haven't. Yes? The question is, how would one know with DNA whether you have Jewish heritage? I will be covering that later on in the presentation, so just hang in there and we'll make sure to get that. So the questions that I want to address tonight are three main ones, and there's a lot of stuff in between. First of all, how does one tell if one's relatives were Jewish? What information, if they were Jewish, what information could you use to track them? And lastly, some of the additional challenges, because there's challenges all along the way. Before we really get into this, what I wanted to mention is that whenever you get into any specialized field within genealogy, and Jewish genealogy is just one. If you get into studies of black genealogy, African American things, or Dutch, or whatever kind of specialized genealogy you're doing, it's always critical to continue with your genealogy best practices. We're always told, start with what you know, work backwards. Absolutely. And search for all the relevant records to answer your question. Don't just stop with one and say, oh, I've got it, they're Jewish, that's it. Continue looking for other evidence for that. So it will bolster your case and make sure you're in the right track and you haven't misinterpreted something. And then, of course, with regard to misinterpreting, you want to keep track of all your the resources you've checked, what you've found, what you've not found. The part that I think is most critical is that you want to try to understand the context of your ancestors' lives, because that will help you understand the context of the records that you're seeing, how they were made, what went into them, who provided the information, and all those things put together will give you the answer that you seek one way or another. So really, when we start talking about someone being Jewish or a Jewish background, what does that mean? And it means several different things. Of course, Judaism is a belief system, and what I will do in the next few slides is explain these a little bit more, but basically three things. That it's a belief system, a religion, that there's a cultural aspect to it, a lifestyle aspect to it, and then we're also talking about an endogamous, that is, an endogamous group is one that marries within their own people. Excuse me, right? And also not only an endogamous group, but throughout history, to a great extent, a segregated population. And all of these things, people can one individual might be all of those things, or maybe just one or two of them, and still be Jewish, or be considered Jewish. And all of these aspects of Judaism certainly impact the kinds of relevant records that you might find or be looking for. So when we talk about belief system, of course, we're talking about a religion. And within Judaism, it's not monolithic. There are several different denominations. I have very much simplified it by saying Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. There are lots of variations within those and lots of sub-denominations within those. Orthodox generally is the most fundamentalist, and Reform generally are those who prefer to feel that the Torah is something to be interpreted so that it's relevant to us. Burial customs, and this is critical with Jewish burial customs, is that Jewish people bury people right away, within 1 or 2 days of death. Traditionally, embalming would not be allowed, although that has changed in the modern world depending upon what the laws are in different places, but people are buried immediately, and the reason for that is the feeling that that is a sign of respect for the dead. Now, there may be mourning for a week beyond that, but they're buried almost immediately. Marriage, the graphic I have here is a marriage ketubah, which is essentially a marriage contract, a Jewish marriage contract. These are things that you would not find in any held by any organization like a synagogue. They would usually be held individually by the married couple. Now, many of them at this point, particularly one as ornate as this, because many of them are not this pretty, have wound up in museums and archives over the years. But generally, if you're looking for a ketubah from your relatives, they'll still be in the family. Circumcision, Records do, there's a person, the ritual person who does the circumcision called a moil. They would keep the records themselves. And so there may be lists of people who were, men who were circumcised, or infants rather, who were circumcised. And then the other aspect of Judaism from a religious standpoint is that it transfers by matrilineal descent. And what that means is if your mother is Jewish and her mother was Jewish, then you're Jewish, okay? If your mother wasn't Jewish, then you're not Jewish. In terms of how the religion feels, okay? Now, in the last few years, that's changed a little bit. Still with Orthodox people, that's how they believed. But if you remember a Reform congregation, they may not hold you to that standard. And if one of your parents was Jewish, they might still consider you that way. And then we get to the cultural lifestyle issues. Generally, there are two groups of Jews culturally. Ashkenazi, which are the people who were in Central and Eastern Europe. Sephardic people who mostly come from Spain and North Africa. There's also another group which in the past has been associated with Sephardic called Mizrahi, and they tend to be in the Middle East area, but some people still lump them in with Sephardic Jews. Languages, there are vernacular languages for both of these groups. Yiddish is a language that was built from Aramaic and Hebrew mixed with German and a little bit of Slavic languages, and really before World War II, by that point, most of the native Yiddish speakers were in Eastern Europe. And then Ladino, which would be the traditional Spanish Jewish language that is from Old Spanish combined with Hebrew. And we know from looking at all these people that there are certain foods we know about that are probably most of the foods that we think of Jewish foods, most of them come from the Ashkenazi tradition because there are many more Ashkenazi Jews than there are Sephardic Jews today. There were differences in dress, and then naming patterns. And we'll talk more about this, but generally Ashkenazi, when they name a child, they name it for someone who is only for someone who is deceased. But this is a cultural thing. It's not a religious prohibition to name after someone who is alive. It's a cultural thing. And Sephardic, on the other hand, will typically name after someone who's alive, but they can name after someone who has died as well. And then there's the issue of the cultural relationship with the outside world. Because Jewish people were a segregated population, they were often segregated within a larger community. And there needed to be ways of interacting as a community with the other portions of the community. So they developed functions that worked for their internal decision making, but also representatives who would represent them to the outside communities. And those in Europe often were called kahals, K-A-H-A-L-S is how we would spell it most likely. Like many different, as I said, segregated communities, sometimes people were given to that, were assigned to be the representative for the outside world. And so you may have, whether internally they followed those people or not is a question, but they use those people as their representatives. Continuing in this vein, we talked about endogamy, marriage within the group, segregated population. Intergroup marriage. The other thing that Jews have traditionally done quite a lot of is first cousin marriage. And that has, of course, and we'll see later, can have a lot of implications for disease and for what we get in our DNA results. They also, it was okay for an uncle to marry a niece. You don't see that as much, but you did see that as well. But first cousin marriage was very common. We also have the concept of the wandering Jew, and let's talk about that a little bit. So Jewish people, and really this is true for everybody, for a great deal of European history, were in what we call manorial economies. And what that meant is they were nobles who owned all the land, all the villages, all the people, They owned the peasants, and they owned the Jews. And usually what happened was you had the peasants farming for the noble. The noble would look around and go, you know, there's a better way I can really improve the value of my property here. If I brought in some Jewish people to process some of this raw material, so what you got, for example, in Eastern Europe is the peasants would grow the grain, the Jews, under license to the noble, would purchase some grain from the peasants, they would turn it into alcohol, and then they'd sell it back to the peasants. Okay? And then the noble would take a cut of that. Now in Germany it was almost the opposite, because Jewish people were kept out of the alcohol industry by various guilds. But a lot of the families that you see now doing a lot of alcohol businesses, not so much beer, but the other businesses, were traditionally Jewish families for this reason. But that wasn't just with alcohol, it was a lot of other things as well. Jews were brought in to do very specific things under license to a noble. And they stayed there at his, you know, if he decided he didn't want them there, they were gone. And that happened a lot. Now, what happened a lot also is they were brought in for a specific purpose, and then after a generation or two, maybe that town couldn't support that original man, the original butcher. We couldn't have his sons being butchers too, because the town couldn't support that many butchers. So you see Jewish people taking on other artisan kind of crafts and becoming peddlers. Settlement was restricted. Usually there was a Jewish quarter, and it stayed that way into Europe, even in Austria to about 1850, before they were allowed to move out of those areas where they were emancipated, and later in some other places. Largely, the population was not rural. They were in towns and villages, towns and cities, not so much agricultural villages. And that's a function of this relationship with the nobility and the peasants. So what you get is you get movement for economic reasons. Sometimes they, you know, if they had some economic reasons why they couldn't stay there, they couldn't make a living, you might see people move even without the permission that they needed. They might ask for permission and wait and wait and wait and just say, I'm leaving, I'm out of here. Wasn't definitely condoned, but that did happen a lot. And then you get expulsions, where someone says, I don't want these people here anymore, you're gone, move. The tendency over time in Europe is that gradually Jewish people tended to move from Western Europe more and more towards Eastern Europe, as there were a lot of expulsions in Germany, and at the same time, some of the nobility in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were inviting them in. So they left and went there. Okay, so here's a question. Were your relatives Jewish, and how do you tell? I think the big question to ask is a question of context. So were Jews allowed to live at that place at that time? And we mentioned a couple of examples. But let me also mention, you know, there was a couple of other places. I can't cover everything in just an hour. But for example, in England, we know in the middle, with the Roman Empire, we did have Jews moving out into various places in Europe. There were some Jewish people in England. In 1290, there was a big expulsion, the Edict of Expulsion. They were told, similar to Spain and many other places, you either leave, you get baptized if you want to stay, or you're gone. That stayed for, you know, 350 years, something like that. Oliver Cromwell, when he was in charge of England, he was, some Dutch Portuguese Jews said to him, you know, we would like to do some trade in England if you let us in. And he said, well, okay, I see the advantage of that. He didn't change the law, but he kind of let them in. By 1700, there were about then 3,000 Jewish people living in London, and later they went to some of the port cities. You will not tend to see them in a lot of the interior rural communities. So again, think about this. If you see someone who you think might be Jewish, but they're living in a backwater, I'm not saying they're not, but you'd really have to look at some other things to determine whether indeed that makes any sense. Is it likely? In the Russian Empire, there was, up until Russia took over the Eastern Europe, which was about 1792, they had a rule of no Jewish people whatsoever in Russia. Although they said that there probably were something less than 2,000 within Mother Russia at that time, a very small amount considering the large landmass. Even after when they took over the Jewish people, or they took over all the people in Eastern Europe, they wound up all of a sudden with all these Jewish people, and so what do we do with them? Well, that's when they created the Pale of Settlement. They said, you can stay there, but you can't leave there. So all the Jewish people were not allowed into the main part of Russia without permission. And they were pretty strict about it. It stayed that way even up to 1897. 94% of the Jews within the Russian Empire still lived in Eastern Europe. They were not in the main part of Russia. The few that you do see were there because they either had highly specialized skills, like medical skills. They were a merchant of the First Guild, which means they paid some big bucks to be able to go into Russia. Or they may have been conscripted, been in the military for a number of years, and as a result, been able to settle. But beyond that, if you think you had a relative who was Jewish and they're living in the interior of Russia, look some other information as well, because it may not make sense unless you can find some other information. I'm going to jump to the United States now, just to give you an idea of some of the records that, just within the United States, that you can look at that would give you some notion as to whether or not a relation may have been, or an ancestor may have been Jewish. Just briefly, as a real quickie discussion of how Jewish people got to the United States, early on, 1570s, 1580s, and even to about 1625, thereabouts, what you see mostly is just a trickle of people, mostly coming from Spain and from Portugal, places that had an Inquisition, and people needed to leave. Maybe they were in some of the Spanish colonies, and they made their way to the United States, mostly as individuals or small families. 1654 is used as the mark of the first main settlement, and what we're talking about here is still pretty small. It was 23 people. They had been living in Recife, Brazil. Recife had gone back and forth between the Dutch, who were very open to Jewish settlement, and to the Portuguese, who had an Inquisition, just like Spain did. Ultimately, Portugal took over Recife, and many Dutch and the Dutch Jews who were living there left. Most of the Jews went to the Caribbean, but there was a group of 23 who settled in New Amsterdam, and which now we know as New York. So that's really the first quote-unquote settlement. After that, again, it's more of a trickle. There are some German people coming in individually. It doesn't get really big until the big German immigration starts in the 1820s through about 1880. You get, as I said, lots of Germans, but also lots of German Jews. And that's the main influx of German Jewish people to this country. And finally, of course, the main immigration that we know about is the between 1880 and 1914. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is, before 1840, there probably were about 10,000 Jews in the United States. By 1880, there were well over 200,000. So that's just mostly the German influx. And then, of course, by the 1920s, we had 4.5 million. So you can see the impact of each wave of immigration. If you were lucky enough to have some relatives who were Jewish who arrived before 1840, there's a wonderful book that was written in 1960 by Malcolm Stern, who is considered to be the father of modern Jewish genealogy. He looked at 600 Jewish genealogies of families in the United States between 1654 and 1840. He used that 1840 cutoff because there were only about 10,000 Jews, and it was manageable. After that, it exploded, and there's no way he could have done a reasonable genealogy. This book is online. You can find it at the American Jewish Archives, and I do have that listed in your handbook, in your handout. Jumping a little bit later, if we look at manifests, manifests really what was asked, the information that was asked on them is direct reflection of what the laws were in the United States at the time. So in 1897, between 1897 and 1903, what you see is they were asking for what was your mother tongue? That's the one on the right here, upper right. They asked, what was your mother tongue? And in this case, they wrote down for Jewish people, they wrote Hebrew, which of course we knew probably wasn't really true. It was really Yiddish. And then they also asked for religion. I mean, I can't even imagine them doing that now. But they asked people, what's your religion? And they wrote down Israelite. And we know, well, that's interesting too. Later, after 1903, they start, and that's the one on the left, they said, well, we're not going to ask those questions, but we will ask what their race or people is. And for that, they would always write Hebrew. So they would identify the country. It could be Poland or Austria or Russia. But if they were Jewish, then they'd be identified as Hebrew. Doesn't always work, however, and the one I have across the bottom is from my great-grandfather, Itzik Mazowitzki. And he was Jewish. But on his, it just says Russian. They didn't, for some reason, identify him or his two traveling companions as Jewish. I don't know why. But so let's say it works 99.9% of the time. I found one of the unusual circumstances. U.S. Census records. Now, I want to mention also, and I'm not going to be talking about census records too much from the old world, but it works that way too. In census records or even more so, census records in the old world, many times they would definitely identify the religion of the people that they were indexing or enumerating. In the United States, not so much. It was sort of a progress. Between 1850 and 1940, they did ask, where were you born? So if you find somebody that says they were born in another country, then you know for sure you had the immigrant generation. Later on, starting in 1880, they start asking, where were your parents born? So that enables you from one entry to maybe figure out whether the immigrant generation was the parents or the subject. They don't really get to a place where you can really identify the Jewish people until about 1910. Between 1910 and 1930, you see the question, what was your native tongue? What was your language you spoke at home? What did you grow up with, kind of thing? What was your original language, particularly for immigrants? And they would write either Yiddish or Jewish. In 1940, that became a supplemental question, so only 2 people out of a whole list might be able to answer that question on any one page. The other thing to look at, and this also works for Europe or for here, is burials. Jewish cemeteries are considered holy. A Jewish cemetery, when it's made, they have a ceremony for consecration, and traditionally only Jewish people are allowed to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. So if you have somebody you're thinking might be Jewish, look in the nearby Jewish cemetery and see if they're buried there. If you have some non-Jews, more and more this is happening now with intermarriage. Perhaps the husband and wife want to be buried together. One is Jewish, one is not. They might have, if they're thinking that way, depending upon the cemetery, they might have a separate section for the Jewish people. And even in places, small towns, now I know like in Tombstone, I was surprised to see, you go to the cemetery in Tombstone, and they've got a little fenced off area that's just the Jewish people. So a lot of times in a larger cemetery, you'll have a small section, and I would assume, I don't know, that that section was in some way consecrated to enable Jewish people to be buried there in a communal cemetery. Now we're going to change direction here a little bit and talk about Jewish surname adoption. Jewish surnames were adopted relatively late in our history, and the reason for this really is that we were in these small, isolated communities. We really didn't need surnames. Everybody knew who everybody else was. Mostly what we had were what we call patronymic names. So it would be, let's say, Shmuel, son of Avraham, okay? Or Leah, daughter of Shmuel, or something like that. So you'd have those two names with it would be your original name. Now, this so patronymics, and patronymics are used in a lot of different places. I know I was looking recently at some Swedish genealogy, and they use that stuff really late. So they have Nell's son. That's not really their last name, because the next generation, it's a different name. It's named after that person's father. So these things, it's not unusual. But within Jewish tradition, it lasted quite a long time as well. With the rise of cities, larger populations, larger population groups, and commerce, where people were traveling to larger communities and they needed to identify themselves more firmly, you start seeing more and more use of surnames. Still, to a great extent in history, those names didn't stick. So perhaps someone might move to a city for a short amount of time, adopt the surname, maybe they'd move back to their original community and not use it anymore. And then next time someone came to them and said, you need a surname, they'd pick a different one. So it can be a mess. Sephardic, yes? Yes, and I will. Yes. The question was, can I put any years to the changes in surnames and when they were adopted? And I will definitely get to that. And this is the first part of it. Sephardic surnames in Spain. They started being adopted in the 10th to 11th century. Now that's pretty early, okay? And when they adopted surnames, and this is true later on with Ashkenazi Jews as well, they adopted surnames. Perhaps they were occupational surnames, place names, names of objects, like cuchilla or something like that, a knife. And maybe an occupational name like baker, whatever that would be in Spanish, that kind of thing. Not untypical from everybody when they started adopting surnames. They frequently changed their names, however, and one of the things that was fascinating if you look at that woman Ginny Milgram's books is she talks about, particularly during the Inquisition, after Jewish people had supposedly converted, if they were caught doing something that smelled of Judaism, let's say, they would be brought in front of a tribunal, and then they'd be watched like hawks after that. They might change their names just to try to blend in a little bit more. What she found is the names kept on changing through history, and it was a real challenge to follow it, and it was the kind of thing where you couldn't skip a generation because you might miss it. In order to follow her family, she had to go very deliberately from generation to generation to track how the surnames changed, and they did. So again, she had to research very, yes, ma'am, yes, what's the question? Okay, well, the question was, or the comment was, that it had a name, Pugel, and the family story is that at Ellis Island it was changed because the people couldn't spell it who were. I wasn't going to talk about Ellis Island a whole lot, but let me say one thing about that. It's a common story, and it's also commonly felt to be false. That the concept is that the actual truth is that no one has ever found a documented case of someone's name being changed at Ellis Island. That the actual manifests were created in Europe, and that the clerks at Ellis Island were first of all told, don't change anything on the manifest. All you're doing is putting check marks, making sure the information is as shown. And the other thing we know about Ellis Island is that they had people representing about 45 different languages, so that anytime someone showed up there, they could find somebody to speak to them in their native language. So likely there's a lot of people who changed their names once they got here, and that's more likely the case. it would have been after. And they made that choice. So many people made that choice because they wanted to sound more American. Blend in. Ashkenazi surnames. What you see is they start changing in the 18th and 19th century. And at that point, a lot of the countries said, well, you need to take names. And for instance, the earliest one to make a law to say to Jews, you need to take names, was in Austria in 1785. Now, just because someone created the law didn't mean that the people did it, because there wasn't necessarily anything pushing them to need to have a name except for this law. And if they didn't feel like doing it, they didn't necessarily do it. The latest was Switzerland in 1863. So the challenge is here, if someone didn't have a surname, is how do you track them back? You can start trying to look at the patronymics, but it may become very difficult without a surname. It's very difficult to get genealogy back very far. And again, when they did take surnames, they took patronymics, like, let's say someone's father's name was Avram. And they had been Yosel, son of Abram. Well, they decided, well, now we have to take a name. We may as well pick one, and why don't we honor our father? So in Eastern Europe, that name would be Abramovich, son of Abram. So then they take that name and they keep it. Or they might take a place name. Let's say they live in Lubin. They were born in Lubin. They now live in Warsaw. He's from Lubin. Let's call him Lubinsky. Okay. Or an occupational name. Garber means leather worker. Animal names, Hirsch, deer. Descriptive names, Klein means small. Okay. All these names could have at some point been related to the people themselves. Yes? That's right, and the Napoleonic Code was great for making sure that everybody developed vital records in their countries as well. And so, yes, there was a lot of influence of that, and I think I've got that someplace in here as well. So, I'm sorry, the question was, how did the Napoleonic Code affect the adoption of surnames? And I was just saying it affected not only the adoption of surnames, but also the adoption of vital records in a variety of countries. Napoleon was the best thing that ever happened to Eastern Europe for a short amount of time. After he left. After he left, it was good. Okay, so what you'll see is many Ashkenazi surnames have German roots. We talked about how the Jews were moving from west to east. In Austria, the names that they had to take, that was a German-speaking country. The country said, you need to take a German-style surname. So you'll see a lot of Jewish surnames have kind of a German spin to them. But there's a lot of names, even though they sound German, they are probably shared with a lot of other Jewish people. So you don't necessarily, just because you have the name Klein, for example, there are a lot of people named Klein who are not Jewish. And so you need to recognize that. Even some of the names that we typically think of as Jewish may not be, ultimately. That you may be able to go to Germany and find people, or in German nations, find people who have those same names who aren't Jewish. Yes? Well, part of it is yes, the question is, why would a lot of Ashkenazi surnames have German roots? I think some of it is the fact that there was a movement from Western Europe towards Eastern Europe. There's also the fact that Yiddish itself has a fairly solid German basis, and a lot of words in Yiddish are very similar to words in German. It's not exact, but so you'll find a lot of similar words. And I think that's probably a lot of why you see similar names even in Eastern Europe that may have sort of a German sound to them. And the other thing is, with all the movement that was going on, you may wind up with siblings adopting different surnames in different places. So if you had family members who were spreading out into different communities, for economic reasons, because they married somebody from a different community, all sorts, whatever reasons there are, that people, move out from the place where they were born. They were in a different location. They had to adopt a surname. They may not have adopted the same surname as their sibling. So you can get people from the same family at the time when surnames were adopted having completely different surnames. And the real thing here is that there are very few surnames that are definitively Jewish. That is, that they come from biblical references or come down through the Torah. The only ones that I could think of offhand quickly would be Cohen. The name, and I didn't really mention this earlier, but in ancient Judaism, we have what we call the Kohanim, which were a priestly caste that supposedly came down from Aaron, Moses' older brother. And they were all called Kohanim. People who are named Cohen are supposedly descended from that priestly caste. Now, there are other names in Judaism that relate to that. The name Kagan is the same as Cohen. It's just from a different language. And Katz is an abbreviation for Cohen. So those kind of names, Cohen, Katz, Kagan, those are probably about the only names, some of the only names you'll find. Just a handful of names that are truly Jewish names. I can't speak for George M. Cohan. I don't know where that came from. That would be an interesting question. So now we move to first names. We get a lot of first names, a lot of questions where people say, oh, well, they've got this first name. Is that a Jewish first name? Well, the name Joseph, Benjamin, Jacob, those are names that are really common and have been common traditionally among both Jews and non-Jews. So that really in itself, again, won't tell you anything necessarily. Now, there are some Old Testament names that sometimes people give us questions about, and they'll say, oh, well, Shadrach, Meshach, those are Old Testament names. Surely that person must have been Jewish. I know. I can't ever remember seeing any Jewish person with any of those names. They just don't have them. It seems like Jewish men in particular have a very small subset of names, and those kind of names, Shadrach, Meshach, I've never, ever seen for a Jewish person. So if you start seeing these heavy-duty Old Testament kind of names, not necessarily, and particularly with ones like you see in that second line there, no. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next phase, tracking your Jewish relatives. So you think you got some Jewish relatives. How are you going to track them? And what records, specifically Jewish records, might help you? The first one I want to cover is rabbinical genealogy, and I want to talk about this because this is an opportunity to take one's Jewish genealogy back probably a couple of hundred more years than one ordinarily would. The reason being that rabbinical families were probably the first ones, particularly in Europe, to adopt formal surnames that they kept from generation to generation. They principally did this and kept their genealogies because they were trying to link themselves back in time to revered, learned men, rabbis, ultimately to King David if they could. So you have to watch it. They were trying to link themselves to someone important. Whether or not it's true is a question. But the fact that they did have early adoption of surnames does help, and in some cases can help you move back probably 100 to 200 years earlier than I can right now. I can probably only go about to 1800. There is a rabbinic special interest group on Jewish Gen, and I would recommend, if you have interest in this, again, this is on your handout, to look at this, to the special interest groups on Jewish Gen and look at the rabbinic one. Now, Sephardic names, we talked earlier that they had a particular naming pattern for their children. What they did, and I think about this, and when I've heard stuff about Irish genealogy, how they decided who got what name, somewhat similar. So the firstborn son would be named after the paternal grandfather, the second-born son after the maternal grandfather, the firstborn daughter after the paternal grandmother, et cetera, going down to aunts and uncles or great aunts and uncles, things like that. They did name after living relatives in general, sometimes after deceased, but usually living relatives. For me, coming from an Ashkenazi background, this was totally foreign. In Ashkenazi things, you won't ever find somebody named after somebody living. It's considered disrespectful and bad luck. One of the good things about the Sephardic situation with names is that the names then can be used to give you some clues as to what the ancestors' names might have been. So again, don't use that as your only clue, but use it as something to help your research along. When you get to Ashkenazi, again, they only name after deceased relatives. And that's pretty much it. I can't think of somebody being named after, and again, this is not a religious thing, it's just a cultural thing. I can't think of anybody named after a living relative. Sometimes you'll find names after famous rabbis. If some family was very religious and they had a favorite rabbi and he had passed away, they might name after him. So you see like a lot of names like Dov Ber, who was a famous rabbi. You'll see several boys named after them. Yes? Yes, yes, absolutely. And I'll show you that in the next slide. You guys are great. You're anticipating. So just to give you an example, again, we have a name like Avraham Abba, and this is actually my great-grandfather's name. Avraham Abba Ben, which means son of, and this is in Hebrew, okay? Yisrael, okay? So his father was Yisrael. His son, one of his sons, his second son, as a matter of fact, was Mordechai ben Avraham Abba, okay? That's his name, his Hebrew name. The next son is Yisrael. Mordecai's son is Yisrael ben Mordechai. Okay? So what has happened here is we can tell that Avraham Abba's father must have been dead by the time Yisrael was born. So let me show you how this would work. This is my great-grandmother, Hannah. She died sometime in the old country, in Ukraine, what is now Ukraine. I wasn't sure when, okay? So I looked at all her children and when they had daughters and what they named them, okay? And this is a shortened version of the chart that I made, but you can see that Jack had Leah, and let me just say, Hannah never came to the United States, and Pearl never came to the United States, but all the other siblings did. So Jack had Leah in September 1917, and then after that you see Annette, Hannah, Anita, and Annette. It turns out all of those people are named after Hannah. Hannah, the typical way of transliterating that or translating it into English would be Hannah or Anna, and back in those days the popular name was Annette, obviously, and Anita, so those are the names they got. Their Hebrew names, however, were Hannah. And so I can tell, looking at this, that Hannah must have died sometime between September 1917 and May 1921, because none of these children would have been named after her, if not. Okay, let's continue with Jewish first names. So what you have usually is, first of all, the Hebrew patronymic, this name, is used for a number of different things. But principally, particularly for men, it's for their spiritual identity. It's used when they're called to read the Torah in synagogue, and it's used on their tombstone when they die. So that's their spiritual identity, is their Hebrew name. So Avraham ben Yisrael would be Avraham's full Hebrew name when he's called to the Torah. It wouldn't just be Avraham. It would include his father's name. Then people have another name. This starts getting to be like one of those old Russian novels, you know, when everybody's got names and nicknames. You know, same thing. Everybody's got more than one name, okay? So you've got your Hebrew name, which you use spiritually, and then you likely have a name in the vernacular, wherever you're living. So in the local language, and usually if it was Eastern Europe, it would have been Yiddish. In Spain, it would have been in Ladino, okay? So then you might have, and sometimes those names were related. So for example, if you had someone whose first name in Hebrew was Aryeh, that means lion in Hebrew. So the family might decide, well, we're going to use the same meaning, take a name with the same meaning for his Yiddish name, and his Yiddish name would be Leib, which also means lion. Similar kind of thing would be the name Zipporah for a girl. That means bird in Hebrew. So they might give her Yiddish name might be Fega, which means bird in Yiddish. Doesn't always have to work that way. Sometimes they're completely unrelated, or sometimes they're related to biblical references, where you get two different names together. But this does happen. So you would look at that and go, well, why are they naming him Aryeh Leib? Well, now you can see if you know what the meanings of the names actually are. Or you can't even get a nickname, and this is where, like I say, it starts getting to be like a Russian novel. So the guy's name in Hebrew might be Yisrael, and maybe they call him Srul. Well, if you kind of cut off the first part of the word and say Srul, you can see where they get, in Yiddish, they got Srul. So you have to kind of know what the nicknames are. And these names, you know, they could be used when Yisrael Srul is in the Russian Empire. He might sign his name Yisrael, if you can, or he might sign it Srul in filling out documents. You don't know which one is going to show up. When he comes over to the United States using a manifest, he might just list his name as Srul, even though you know his name is Yisrael. So you have to be able to identify and know that that's really the same name. Just to give you an idea of what a tombstone would look like, and this one is for my great aunt. She married into the family. Her name in Hebrew on top, the first line under, the first two letters are here lies, and then it says Etta Bat Levi Yitzhak. So Levi Bat is daughter of, Levi Yitzhak is her father, his two names. And then she's got her name in the American vernacular. So what happened with a lot of these people, of course, the people who are immigrants may have had three names. Okay, they had their Hebrew name, they had their Yiddish name that they used in the old country, they may have even had a Russian name. Okay, well, that's possible. Then they came over to the United States and they said, you know, I want to be an American. I'm going to be Yetta. That's my American name. Now we look at it and go, that's not an American name, but then it sounded to them like an American name, right? It's like practically every Fega I know. There's no rules, but practically every Fega that I've seen became Fanny. And when I think of Fanny, it sounds like a Jewish name to me, but it's not. At the time, that sounded American to them, and they took that name. There were no rules, whatever they liked. If you want help with translation, and we all do, because most of us can't speak all these different languages, JewishGen has a fantastic opportunity on its website. It's called ViewMate, and I do have it, I believe, a link listed for it on the handout. And what you can do on ViewMate is you can upload digital files, and people can look at them, and a lot of people volunteer, they troll, and they will translate things for you. You can also post pictures, post documents, post headstones, whatever you want. And it's a wonderful opportunity to get these things translated. And just to show you, you know, this is the name variation, just some examples of some of the name variations you can get, and they go with each other. So Avram might be the same person as Avraham. Itzik would be Yitzhak. Okay, Itzik would be the Yiddish version. Mordko would be for Mordechai. Again, I showed you Yisrael and Srul. Now, you know, Eliezer, Lazer, Ephraim, Froim. Now, again, there's no rules for this, but a lot of times what happens, you have someone whose name was Eliezer. They come to the United States, and all of a sudden they take the name Lewis, and someone goes, well, where did they get that from? Probably because their nickname had been Lazer, and they wanted to do something with the same sound for the first letter. They didn't have to, but that's what they chose to do. So just to give you an idea. So these names basically are the same people. But again, like I say, it's like a Russian novel. You have every page, the names change, and you got to keep track of it. Okay. Synagogue and community records. Here's the bad news. Synagogues don't often keep good records. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. You just don't know. When my mother's family, her father and his parents came to the United States, they initially settled in a little town called Hudson, New York, just south of Albany. And I went there, and I know they lived there from about 1898 through 1904, and I went to the synagogue, and I said, do you have anything from back in that era? And they said, no, we threw everything out. There had been like three synagogues. They all joined together, and this synagogue didn't have anything from that early at all. It was gone. A lot of Jewish communities also, they had mixed feelings about keeping records. They didn't want to. Or they felt I've seen places where people argued, well, the Talmud says you shouldn't keep records, and someone said, well, but the other one says you should. There were arguments within the community. So it wasn't something that was traditionally done or that was always accepted. Typically, there were records kept by rabbis individually and by moils. Those are the people who did circumcisions. But those were personal records, and when they went to another town, they would take them with them. It wouldn't stay in the synagogue. And most of those have been lost. There are some places where you can find them. I know that on Jewish Gen you can find some. The American Jewish Archives, which is in Cincinnati, has some. YIVO, and I believe also the Leo Baeck Institute, which is in New York City and specializes in German Jewry. They have some. So it pays to look if you know where, what communities and maybe those moils or those rabbis served in those communities. Look and see. You never know what you might find, but don't be disappointed, horribly disappointed, if you find that there really isn't anything. Jewish community records, somewhat similar. There are some community records that are kept in local archives in Eastern Europe. I think a lot of times that's because of their interaction, that it was kept by the government, not the community itself. There are some community records. They used to keep things they used to call pincus, which were sort of the story of different communities over time. Some of those have been saved, and you can find them in some archives. The Central Archive for the History of the Jewish People, that's in Jerusalem. They've been collecting this kind of stuff, and some of those other organizations I mentioned previously. So you should check. Yes? Mostly it would be things like marriages. What type of information is, the question is, what type of information would you find kept by rabbis or moils? It would mostly be the ceremonies that they conducted. So if they did a marriage ceremony, obviously the moil, it would be all the boys that they did circumcisions on. They might. But there was no rules about it. So you would think that they would, yes, because it would likely have the Hebrew patronymic. So you would hope that it should have at least the father's name, most likely. The other thing to check is a website called Roots to Roots. And this is a website that at the time when the Soviet Union fell, this woman, Miriam Weiner, she went out to all the archives in Eastern Europe and said to them, what records do you have from Jewish people? And most of them responded to her, and she built a database which is online. And you can search that by community. If you know the community name, you can put that into her website, and she will tell you which archives in Ukraine or Lithuania or Poland or various different countries have records from those towns. And sometimes you do see community records, sometimes you see census records, sometimes you see some vital records, things like that, voting lists. Getting back to, we were talking about vital records and when did they start? 1784, the Austrian Empire said we want to start doing vital records. As I said, whether or not people paid a whole lot of attention is a question. A lot of those records might have been kept in churches. Jewish records were usually kept separately, however. But Napoleon is really the one who made a difference. And if you know anything about Napoleon, he was short-lived in terms of his Roman Empire. But he did do something that was, a few things that were amazing. First of all, he was coming off of the French Revolution, so equality. So he got rid of a lot of this manorial system with people living as peasants and nobles and things like that. He pushed it as hard as he could, wasn't always successful, but in a lot of cases was able to emancipate people in different countries so that they weren't so much the slaves to the lord or of the manor. He also implemented standards for keeping vital records, marriage, birth, death. He usually had forms that they had to, or not so much forms, but items that needed to be in the vital record. It was often in paragraph form, but it would have the same information for each event, written in a very standardized fashion. It was such a good idea that even after he lost his fight trying to get into Russia, and then gradually, over the next year or so, his empire fell apart, the countries where he had been kept records. Even countries where he had not been, where he had not conquered, but who were allies of his, like the Austrian Empire, they maintained the systems that he had fostered. And of course, a lot of this meant that particularly in Austria, that you had more of the names surnames becoming standardized. Now, in Russia, however, and he didn't conquer Russia, so those of us whose families were mostly from the Russian Empire didn't benefit, unfortunately, from a lot of this. In Russia, in 1826, they said all the religions need to keep their own vital records. So they would appoint a rabbi in the Jewish community and say, you keep the vital records. And they also said around that time, by the way, you need to adopt surnames. Everybody said, yeah, right, okay, whatever. Later, it wasn't until about 1843, I believe, that Russia came back again and had another law that said, we really meant it when we said Jews needed to adopt surnames in 1826, and by that time they finally did. The 1826 law didn't have as much an effect on establishing the surnames as it did until about 1840. Even when records were finally taken over were taken out of the churches and were taken over by the government keeping the records, even then Jewish records were kept in separate record books. So again, if you're trying to figure out whether a relative of yours was Jewish, and if you can find them in one of these record books, then you're doing well. Now, we all know because of the Holocaust, a lot of records were lost, but there still are a lot of records. And that's been the excitement that has occurred since the fall of the Soviet Union, is with the opening of the archives in a lot of these former satellite nations, we're now finding that there still are records and we can get access to them. The question is, how do you get access to the records? And I will talk about that, but there are a lot of Jewish genealogists doing some wonderful work accessing and indexing and translating records, and they are more and more accessible. More and more is coming online all the time. It's very exciting. Let's see. Oh, so your research tip, again, what I said is if you find them in the record books, yeah, they're probably Jewish. So we're getting back to the Holocaust, and there were books that were things that were lost. In the Holocaust, of course, there were people that were lost, obviously. Many, many people that were lost from a variety of religions and a variety of walks of life. But there were also records that were created as a result of the aftermath of the Holocaust. And one of those types of records is what we call Yizkor books. And Yizkor books were books that were developed after World War II by members of the community remembering their neighbors and their family members who had died. So they're typically written in Hebrew. A lot of them were created in Israel or Yiddish. Some of them were created in the United States in Yiddish by the native speakers from those communities. Jewish Gen, let me first say that a lot of these are online at the New York Public Library. They've been digitized and completely online, and some other places as well. Jewish Gen has it in the process of translating many of these. And when I say Jewish Gen, I have to say that Jewish Gen is a volunteer organization. I think they have 3 paid staff members. So when I say Jewish Gen, I mean the entire volunteer effort. It's not those 3 people. Okay? There are people raising money, for these volunteer efforts to get translators, to get the documents, to get copyright approvals if necessary, and all this stuff is coming online. It's very exciting. Generally what happens is someone has a town that they're interested in, there's a Yizkor book for it. They, along with other town members, start doing processes to translate. Yes? Right, and the comment is that Yiskor books really are talking about more the time just prior to the Holocaust, that if your relatives left that community, like in the last part of the 19th century or early 20th century, it may not seem as relevant. That's true to a certain extent, but you will also find in a lot of these Yiskor books that there are several chapters about the history of the community. And some of it will go back a little ways into the 20s and teens. So, there may be people in your family still in those books. I have found, I know that, like I was saying, that when I showed that Hannah's family, there were two sisters who never left that community. One of them did die in that community. And she's enlisted in some of those Holocaust records. So you can find that, and you may find other family members. But yes, you're right. There is that issue. And again, for Holocaust records, Yad Vashem has what they call the Shoah Names Database, which is a database of people who died in the Holocaust. What they've done, there's several different items that are in this database now. The initial effort was to collect what they call pages of testimony from people who had knowledge of people who had died in the Holocaust in that location. So you can search that by town, you can, excuse me, you can search it by name of the person. It's got some good information, and a lot of these, because these were provided by people whose native languages, were a variety of native languages, Russian and Yiddish and Hebrew and English. You find them in all different languages. They've translated them, they've indexed them, and you can read them online. The actual pages of testimony have been digitized. And then, of course, there's the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In the 1940s, there was something called the International Tracing Service. They collected lots of records about Holocaust survivors, and they were affiliated with the Red Cross. And it was based pretty much, it was an international effort, but it was based in Germany. Up until recently, they've been very tight with the records. In the last few years, they've been copying them and letting other entities have copies of them so people can look at them and study them. And so the Holocaust Memorial Museum is gradually getting copies of these international tracing service records, which is really good news for understanding what happened to people after the Holocaust. Okay, so now we're into challenges. Let me take a slurp of water here. We've talked about some of these challenges already, but we'll continue, and I think most of this whole thing is a challenge, but we'll continue anyway. We've talked about, really, if you're going to move back across the ocean, before you get to the old country or when you're working in the old country, you really have to know as much as possible about people. I can't stress enough the need to do all your research in this country for immigrants before you try to track them abroad. The reason being, because of all these name changes, place changes, names changes of places, you may not be able to find them unless you know as much about them as possible. So, and it's very typical with new Jewish genealogists. The first thing they want to know is, where did their family come from, and can I find records about them? Don't do that. Start here. Get your family tree really well done, and then jump the ocean and see what you can find. Yes? Uh-huh. It varies. Jewish cemeteries may or may not be arranged by date. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes, so the point was made that in this case the family knew the Yiddish name or the Hebrew name and didn't realize what the name was that had been adopted in the United States, which made looking at cemetery records a challenge. But when you found the Hebrew name on the tombstone, you were able to confirm then with census records that this was indeed, and perhaps death records, that this was indeed the same person. I have a similar story, not so much looking, just surprised at what the name was. I had a great aunt, Fega. That's all I ever heard her called. It wasn't until I started doing genealogy that I found that every record, American record, that she's recorded in her name is Fanny. I never knew that. And then of course my grandfather, his name was Yankel, which would be which in Yiddish, and his Hebrew name was Yaakov, Jacob. He came over here. He didn't like the name Jacob, so there are some records that he's Jacob and some records that he's Jack. And sometimes it's like the Social Security. They used both, and I was shocked. There's one record in Social Security. I think his SS5 has one name, and his death index is another name. I was like, how did that happen? But so yeah, you have to be flexible. So again, we had names for religious needs. We had names for community needs, and sometimes it was because you're moving different places. Sometimes it's because you need to protect yourself from the Inquisition authorities. And then, of course, there were government edicts that made people change their names. And exactly the kind of thing that you're saying, you really it helps to know all the different names in order to track these people. With changing political boundaries, place names also changed. And just to give you an example, this is Labun, is the town that my father's family is from. When it was within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was Labun, that starts with that L with the line through it, which is the Polish alphabet, Polish spelling. In Yiddish, it would have been spelled Labun, like I have it there, or possibly Lubin. In 1792, that area was taken over by Russia. They actually kept the same name. So in Cyrillic, that third name there actually says Labun. But when the Soviet Union fell and Ukraine became independent, and I think this is because the name Labun is associated with Polish nobility, they changed the name of the community. And now that last Cyrillic there is in Ukrainian, and the name of the town is Yurovshina. Go figure. It was a whole lot easier Labun because it's only 5 letters as opposed to Yurovshina, which in English is even longer than that. So you have to know these names. The other one that comes to mind, which is very well known in Judaism, is the town of Lemberg, which was the name of a town in the Austrian Empire. When it went into the Russian Empire, it became, or to the Soviet Union, it became a Russian name, and it became Lvov, okay? And then when it went to becoming Ukrainian, as it is now it's Lviv. So if your family said they were from Lemberg when they came over in 1898, you need to know today that town is Lviv, and oh, by the way, 20 years ago it was Lvov. All right, so you need to know these things. So again, genealogy best practices really come into play with all of this, is doing your homework, knowing the context, and getting information from your collateral relatives, because you may find, particularly with, and we were just talking about this, with the name of a community, you may see the name of community with one person that you're looking at in one record, but check several different records. And not only that, check if you know any siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, who may have been from that town or a nearby town. You may see somebody with a completely different name of a town. And then you find out, when you look at a map, oh my goodness, they said they were from different towns, and that confused me, but then I looked at the map and I found out they're only 8 miles away. So it may not be wrong. It may just be the next town over. So these are things you need to understand. Jewish Gen, again, I keep on going back to Jewish Gen. I highly recommend that you explore the website. It's got tons of information on there, tons of things you can get educated about. They've got a thing they call the Jewish Gen Communities Database. It's essentially an online gazetteer. And a gazetteer usually gives you little bits, it may not have maps, but this one does. It gives you little bits of information about the communities, their history, name changes, which is a critical part. You know, all the different, they will list all the different names. You can put in and it works with Soundex, so you can put in a name, and it'll give you names that sound like that. It will also give you the prior names of the communities or subsequent names of the communities, so you can try to figure out where you are. Maps. This is not a Jewish site, but it's an Eastern European family history site, Foundation for East European Family History Studies, and that website address is on your handout. And then, again, within Jewish Gen, and there are some ones that are made outside of Jewish Gen, websites, web pages that are designed to honor and remember particular Jewish communities in Europe or anywhere around the world, even some in the United States. On Jewish Gen, they call them Kahila Links web pages, and individual volunteers who have an interest in a particular town will create a web page just for that town. They may go to the Ellis Island website and find all the people who came over from that town. They may collect records. They may have been to the town recently and they'll post photographs. So there's it's variable, just like US Gen Web is variable because it depends upon the volunteer of who's building the site. Again, we've talked with the fall of the Soviet Union, research access opened up. Definitely look at Miriam Weiner's Roots to Roots to see what she's saying is in a variety of archives. The Family History Library, everything opened up to them as well, and they've recorded a lot of stuff. They've had trouble with some countries and some places. Even within certain countries, certain archives are more open than others. It's very variable. Jewish genealogy groups, we had the question earlier, how do we get records? A lot of Jewish genealogy groups are acquiring and indexing records. They're getting them translated and they're creating indices. Big one, if your family was from Greater Poland into the area of Galicia, which is a province that had been in the Austrian Empire, where a lot of Jewish people were, Jewish records indexing, when the Soviet Union went away, Jewish records indexing approached Poland's archives and said to them, if you let us access your Jewish records and index them, we will post the index online as a searchable database. And then when people find their relatives through these indices, they will order the records from you. Cool. And that was great. It's even better now, because now Poland is just amazing. Poland has decided they are going to digitize all records in their archives for everybody, not just Jewish people, everybody. So Jewish records indexing is way ahead of the game because they already have indices for a lot of these records. There are a number of records that are already online. If Jewish records indexing has indexed them on the page, once you find the record on the index, there's a spot. If you click that, you jump to the Warsaw Archives website and you can see the record immediately. So that's like amazing. No country is better right now in Eastern Europe than Poland. And this is actually incorrect. It's the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People. I caught a mistake I made. They're in Jerusalem. They go out to archives in Eastern Europe every summer. They're working closely with them. They're able to take digital images of a lot of records, and they're working with a number of Jewish Gen special interest groups to digitize them. So a lot of these special interest groups are going into Romania, they're going into Germany, they're going into Hungary, they're going to all these countries, hiring researchers, hiring people to take digital images of records with the approval of various archives, and they're indexing these records. So there's a lot of stuff, and it's just changing daily. It's a very exciting time to be involved in Jewish genealogy if you want to get records in the old country. Last, I want to stop to talk about DNA a little bit. Now, when we talked about DNA several years ago, when it first started getting big, DNA for genealogy, mostly they were talking about the Y DNA, which is you know, the father's line, or mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA, which covers the mother's line. The problem with all these is that they do tend to go back quite far beyond the genealogical record. They'll give you something that's solid, perhaps, but what does it mean? Unless you can tie it to some genealogy record. And there were some initial studies, principally because of the endogamous nature of the Jewish community, that were very promising initially. Initially, they were finding that there were some Y-DNA haplogroups that were associated with Jewish populations, although it is a moving target, so I'm not going to say, you know, that it's solid. mtDNA, interestingly enough, more recently, they're saying, well, when you study the female line within the Jewish people, we're seeing more that maybe that wasn't so solidly Jewish. Maybe you had, their guess is, maybe you had Jewish men going into Europe and taking non-Jewish wives. Who knows? You know, as I say, more and more we get people tested, the more we learn. But they are definitely affected by the endogamy of the population and the fact that there's a lot of first cousin marriage. Now, because of the history that we've talked about and changing names, you very well may find that you've got some Y-DNA matches, very close matches, with people. You know, ordinarily you think of, well, Y-DNA, it's a father's line, they ought to have the same last name. Well, you may find in the Jewish tradition, they've got different last names. And I just actually found that recently in my own family, and it's very cool. I tested my brother for Y-DNA, and I tested my father's first cousin. And they match exactly at the 37 marker level, which is a pretty good level of matching. And I tested, because I had been doing some research, I asked somebody whose last name is Garber. I asked this guy whose last name was Liederman, because I was finding, I couldn't figure out how we could possibly be related, but his family, there was a family member of his who showed up where they shouldn't have been, ordinarily. And I asked him to test. He matches my brother and my father's first cousin exactly at the 37 marker level. I went, what the heck? But, and I've also did, and I'll talk about autosomal in a moment, did some autosomal testing that shows he should be maybe a second to third cousin. I know he's not a second cousin, possibly third cousin, but I don't have the records that go back that far. I don't have my great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather records to know. And we can't make that connection. But it would make sense with all the history that we've talked about with the changing surnames that it's quite possible that we could have, I could have a family member, a close family, relatively close family member with a completely different last name under Y-DNA. So late adoption. So the one we want to really talk about, though, is autosomal. And that's because that's the one that everybody's talking about. It's the one that everybody's doing right now. The autosomal test is on family tree DNA. It's called the Family Finder. It's also the test you would take from Ancestry or the test you would take from 23andMe. It's also the test when you listen to Henry Louis Gates on PBS, when he stands there at the end of the program and hands them this chart, this pie chart that tells them their ethnic makeup and surprises them. I don't know why they're all so surprised. That's the test that he's using. Autosomal provides two different kinds of information. It provides that nice pie chart of breakdown of your ethnic makeup, but it also predicts how close your relationship is with people. So when you, in family tree DNA, they'll say to you, well, you know, you're third to fourth cousin, possibly. You're within the range in terms of how many chromosomes you're matching. So when back in March 2013, I did a blog post, and I was talking about my autosomal results, and I got a BlackBerry Pi. That it was totally 100. They said 100% Jewish, Middle East Jewish at the 0.01% plus or minus. I went, okay. It was disappointing, but then it kind of made me proud, you know. Not very diverse, but this is what they show now. Okay, so they've changed the algorithm. They've got more people testing. So things are changing. Now they're showing that I'm 93% what they call Jewish diaspora, 5% European, 1% Middle Eastern. I don't exactly know what, this doesn't do much for me. It's amusing, but whatever. So understand that when you get this kind of thing, it's a moving target. You may show some level of Jewish people in there. It may change the next time they change the algorithm when they've got more people testing. I did want to mention a study that's been done, and what these people did was they went and looked at the autosomal testing results that family tree DNA was coming up with, particularly in terms of the Jewish population. They took a sample of 40 Jewish people, 40 non-Jewish people, and then I think 20 who were, had mixed marriages, kind of thing, were descendants of mixed marriages. What they found, that they looked at the number of matches. They found that Jewish people had 4 to 6 times the number of matches in autosomal DNA than with other people who had taken the test than the non-Jewish people did. And this is something that family tree DNA has noticed, that I don't know how many of you have taken the test. I have like 400 people matching me in autosomal DNA, which is a lot, okay? Apparently, non-Jewish people don't get that many matches. And the question is, what do you do with this and why? And most of the matches they found were in the 4th to 5th remote cousin range for Jewish people. Now, for most of us, that's really out of it's bordering or maybe already out of our genealogical record range. So it's hard to know, how to deal with it. But this paper, analyzed it, and they said, it really does relate to this endogamy situation. That you're related to more distant cousins in multiple ways. So they kind of, if you're Jewish, because of all the first cousin marriage, you wind up with more distant cousins looking like they're closer than they should be because they're related to you in several different ways. And I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, okay, my father's parents, my grandparents, were first cousins. And so my brother and I are also third cousins. All right? Oh yeah, I figured that out. I was like sitting there with my little tree. Okay, so now when you're in the closer range, that change doesn't affect so much when you're more closely related. But when they're further away and have just snippets of DNA that match, it makes a big difference. So Jewish people tend to have more distant cousins showing up, and that's probably why we have so many more matches. What family tree DNA has done, and may change again as a result of studies like this, is create an algorithm to deal with this with Jewish people and kind of adjust it. But that's something to think about if you have a substantial amount of Jewish DNA, is you may have more matches than you can actually go back and figure out based upon matching it up with the genealogical paper record. Yes? Yeah, okay, the question is, how can we use DNA in genealogy? And I think, yes, the answer is we can use it in genealogy, but we have to be careful with it, because mostly what you get in autosomal DNA testing, or any kind of DNA testing, is an estimate. They're not giving you a definite. They're saying you're likely related to this person, or particularly in autosomal. You're related to this person, you may be as close as a second cousin or as far away as a fourth cousin. Now that's only so good as, like I say, if you can match it up with a paper record and really show, well, what kind of cousin am I? In the case that I talked about, where I was able to match on Y-DNA a person with a totally different name, I had been tracking somebody who came to the United States with my great-grandfather, the great-grandfather who had lost Chana in the old world. He was supposedly a widow. So who is this woman? Okay. She, on his manifest, she was identified as a wife, but on another manifest, she was, for my great-grandfather's children, she was identified as a cousin living in Warsaw, one of that was left behind in the old world. But I had never heard of this person. The name was unfamiliar to everybody. Tracked her and found out that I wound up tracking her brother's son, actually. I found the brother, found the son in Cincinnati and then in Detroit, tested him and found out that, in fact, we are highly likely related. So now that's kind of cool because I had not been able to figure it out with any records. But now that I know it may be worth my while to go dig a little deeper in Eastern Europe and see if I can. I may not be able to find any records in this particular location. There's a lot of records that were lost. But I'm sure going to give it the old college try because now I've got some additional reason to think that it's probably true. So that's one of the ways you can use it. Again, ties may be difficult to find with records, but it's something that you need to think about. So let's improve your research. Use your genealogy best practices. Exhaustively search for those relevant records. Make sure you have more than one indication of some information. And definitely consider the context of your study. For education, Jewish Gen has a number of online classes. And they also have the discussion groups, which I highly recommend you subscribe to. You can subscribe as a digest or individual emails. There's a lot of good discussion that goes on about genealogical issues in the Jewish genealogy field. There are a number of Jewish genealogy societies. If you want to know what those are, you can get on the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies website. They have a list of member societies all over the United States. And there is one in Phoenix. And the other thing about the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies is they have a conference every year, a big conference. A couple of years ago it was in Boston. This past summer it was in Salt Lake. And this coming year it's going to be in Israel. So they move it around and they periodically do hold it overseas as well. Blogs, I would get on Geneabloggers if you're interested in bloggers. If you go to his roster of Geneabloggers and you put in Jewish, you can find all the bloggers who say they're talking about Jewish genealogy. You might also look for DNA or whatever you're interested in and read blogs. And lastly, there's a lot of pages, more and more. I can barely keep up with it on Facebook for Jewish genealogy and all sorts of different aspects of it. Probably the biggie at this point, the one that's got the most people reading it and posting on it, would be Tracing the Tribe. And I highly recommend you look at Shelley Dardashti's Tracing the Tribe. Thank you.